She knelt in the snow beside a grave that should never have been dug, and she put her bare hands around the cold hands of a man who had walked out into a blizzard to die. He was 27 years old. His sister had been 16. And what he was about to confess to her alone on that ridge in the dark was a secret three brothers had carried for 3 winters without speaking it aloud, even to themselves. She had been in their house for 27 days. She was not going to let him die tonight. This is the story of a mail-order bride who stepped off a stagecoach into nothing, and the 3 mountain men who were waiting for her without knowing it. Stay with me. The wind is coming down off the high passes, and the fire is lit, and the story begins now. The Pittsburgh boarding house had a smell that Verity Brennan would remember for the rest of her life. It was the smell of camphor and burned coal, of damp wool drying on radiators of cabbage soup that the landlady made on Tuesdays because cabbage was cheap. It was the smell of a place where people went when they had nowhere left to go. It was a Tuesday in late October of 1879 when she sat at the warped wooden desk by the window and read the letter for the 27th time. The paper had grown soft from her hands. The creases where she had folded and unfolded it had begun to tear. She did not need to read the words anymore. She knew them. But the act of reading them was a kind of prayer. The letter was brief. The handwriting was firm. The letters squared off like fence posts driven deep into hard ground. There were no flourishes, no wasted ink. Miss Brennan, the letter began, I am writing in response to your inquiry of August 14th. I have a homestead in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory. I have 2 brothers who live with me. We are honest men. The work is hard. The winters are long. I cannot promise you ease. I can promise you a roof, food, respect, and protection. I am 33 years old. I do not drink to excess. I do not lie. If you choose to come, I will meet you at Fort Benton on whatever day your stagecoach arrives. The fare west will be paid by my brother Garrett, who is enclosing a draft for $120. If, after 30 days, you wish to return to Pittsburgh, the fare back will also be paid, and there will be no obligation between us. Yours in good faith, Ezra Thorne. Verity folded the letter once more and placed it on the desk. Her fingers trembled slightly. She did not look at the small carpet bag in the corner of the room. She did not look at the empty hook on the wall where her mother's good winter coat had hung until last Saturday when she had sold it to a pawnbroker on Liberty Avenue for $4.70. She looked at the cameo brooch in her left hand instead. It was the size of a robin's egg. The carving was of a woman in profile, her hair piled high in the old Roman fashion. The setting was rolled gold, slightly tarnished now after 22 years of being touched by her mother's fingers and then by hers. It was the only thing she still owned that her mother had owned, the only thing in this room, in this city, in this country that proved she had ever belonged to anyone. She pinned it to the high lace collar of her traveling dress. She picked up the carpet bag. She walked out of the boarding house and down the wooden stairs and into the gray Pittsburgh afternoon, and she did not look back. 3 weeks later, the stagecoach driver pulled the team to a halt on the rutted road outside Fort Benton, Montana Territory, and the door swung open into nothing. That was the only word for it, nothing. Verity stepped down onto the frozen ground and turned slowly in a complete circle, and what she saw was a single low row of plank buildings, a livery stable, a saloon with a lantern burning in the window, even at 4 in the afternoon, and behind all of it, the slow brown ribbon of the Missouri River, and beyond the river, the foothills of mountains so vast and so silent that they seemed less like landscape and more like sleeping animals. A wind came down from those mountains, and it carried snow on its breath. It was the first snow of the year, and it fell in slow drifting flakes that did not yet stick, and the flakes touched her face and melted there, and she felt her cornflower blue eyes begin to sting, and she told herself it was only the cold. She had imagined a town, she had imagined a depot, she had imagined a station agent who would direct her to a respectable hotel where she could wash and change before meeting the man whose letter she had carried in her pocket for 3,000 miles. There was no town, there was no depot, there was a saloon and a livery in a single street, and at the end of the street in the direction the wind was coming from, there was nothing but mountains. The driver tossed her trunk down from the roof of the coach. It hit the frozen ground with a sound like a coffin being lowered. 3 men were walking toward her from the direction of the livery stable. They walked the way mountains walk if mountains could walk. Slow, heavy, inevitable. They were wrapped in heavy coats of buffalo hide and bear, their hats pulled low, and even at 50 paces she could see that they were enormous. The smallest of the 3 was taller than any man she had known in Pittsburgh. The largest had to duck his head as he passed under the lintel of the livery door, and the lintel had been built for cattle. Verity took a small step backward without meaning to. Her hand went to the cameo at her throat. If you turn around now, she thought the driver will let you back on the coach. He has not yet driven away. There is still time. Pittsburgh is 3 weeks behind you, but it is still there. The boarding house is still there. The river is still there. The river, the pawn shop, the cabbage soup, the empty hook on the wall. She did not turn around. The tallest of the three reached her first. He stopped at a respectful distance, perhaps 6 feet, and he removed his hat. His hair was the color of chestnut wood that had been weathered by sun. His eyes were the color of whiskey held up to firelight. There was a 2-day stubble on his jaw and a thin, pale scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline, and Verity understood, without being told, that this was the man who had written the letter. "Miss Brennan," he said. His voice was deeper than she had expected. It was a voice that did not need to be raised because it had never been doubted. He held the hat against his chest with both hands. He did not extend his hand to shake hers. She understood that this was not rudeness. This was a careful man who had measured the distance between strangers and had decided not to cross it without permission. "I am Ezra Thorne," he said. "These are my brothers, Garrett, Silas." The middle brother grinned. He had a wide, white smile that did not quite belong on a face so weathered, and his eyes were the gray blue of a winter sky just before a storm. "Pleased, ma'am," he said. He tipped his hat and immediately stepped past her and lifted her trunk from the ground as though it weighed nothing. He carried it toward a sled drawn by 2 heavy bay horses that Verity had not even noticed standing across the road. The youngest brother did not speak. He nodded once. His eyes were a darker gray than his brother's, the color of slate after rain, and there was something in those eyes that did not match the rest of him. He was the handsomest of the three, by any measure she could name, but he carried himself like a man who had been hollowed out and was holding himself upright by force of habit alone. He did not meet her gaze for more than half a second before his eyes slid past her shoulder to the mountains. That was Silas, she would remember later. The first thing she ever knew about Silas Thorne was that he could not look at a stranger's face without flinching. "Ma'am," Ezra said, "the storm coming down the pass is going to be a hard one. We aim to be home before dark. The sled is faster than the wagon. If you have no objection, we will ride through the night." She had every objection. She had imagined a hotel, a hot bath, a meal, a night of sleep on something that was not a stagecoach bench. She looked at Ezra Thorne. His face was patient. He was waiting for her answer. He was not telling her what would happen. He was asking. "I have no objection," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. The cold had hardened it. Ezra nodded once. He turned and walked to the sled. Garrett had already loaded the trunk and was tucking heavy bear robes into the bench seat. Silas had untied the horses and was standing at the head of the team, murmuring something to them in a low voice that the horses seemed to understand. Verity walked across the frozen ruts of the road. She climbed up onto the sled bench. Garrett sat to her right and Ezra to her left, and she found herself wedged between 2 enormous men whose shoulders were so broad that she could not see past them in either direction. Silas swung up to the driver's seat in front and lifted the reins. "The mountain doesn't care," Garrett said quietly to her, but his voice was kind. "But you keep this robe pulled up to your chin, ma'am, and you'll be all right tonight." The sled lurched forward into the falling snow. The first hour she did not speak. She watched the sky turn from gray to bruised purple to black, and she watched the snow come down harder, and she watched the breath of the horses rise in white plumes that the wind tore apart before they could climb. The track was narrow. On one side rose a wall of dark pine. On the other fell away a slope so steep that she did not look at it twice. The runners of the sled hissed against the snow. Ezra spoke first. He did not turn his head when he spoke. His eyes stayed on the trail. "Your letter said your father was a music teacher." "Yes," she said. "What did he teach?" "Piano, mostly. Some violin. He taught at a girls' academy in Pittsburgh until the tuberculosis took his lungs. After that, he gave private lessons in our parlor until he could no longer climb the stairs." Ezra was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "There is a piano in the cabin." She turned her head sharply. "It was our mother's," he said. "It came up the river on a steamboat in 1861 and then up the trail on a wagon. It has not been played in 3 years." He did not say why. He did not need to. The way he said the words 3 years was the way a man says the name of a wound. 2 hours later, somewhere on the long, slow climb up into the foothills, they passed a low rise to the right of the trail, and on the rise stood a small wooden fence enclosing a single grave. The fence was painted white. The paint was fresh. Someone had painted it within the last summer. There was no marker visible from the trail, only the fence and the small mounded shape inside it covered now in a foot of new snow. A cluster of dried wildflowers had been wedged between 2 of the fence palings, and the wind had not yet carried them away. Whose grave is that? Verity asked. Her voice was low. Beside her, Garrett went perfectly still. Ezra answered, "My mother," he said. His voice did not change. In front of them, on the driver's seat, Silas Thorne pulled the reins so hard that the horses tossed their heads. His knuckles, she saw in the lantern light, had gone white. Ezra reached forward without looking and laid one hand briefly on his brother's shoulder. Silas relaxed the reins. Verity did not ask anything else. She had been raised in a house where her mother had taught her that there were questions a woman did not ask in a stranger's home, and she understood that she was about to enter a stranger's home, and that the answer to the question she had just asked was a lie, and that the lie was being told for a reason she did not yet understand. She filed the moment away. She would remember it. They came down into the valley a little before midnight. The snow had stopped falling. A high, pale moon had come out from behind the clouds, and by its light, Verity saw the homestead for the first time. It was bigger than she had imagined. She had imagined a cabin. What she saw was a two-story house of squared logs, the chinking pale between the dark beams with a steep roof of split shake and a wide porch that ran the length of the front. To the left stood a heavy timber barn larger than the house itself. To the right stood a smaller building with a chimney of its own, and through the window of that building she could see the faint orange glow of a banked stove, and she would later learn that this was Silas Thorne's wood shop, and that the light burned there even when no man was working in it, because Silas could not bear to come home in the dark to a building that had no light. This was not a homestead. This was a kingdom in miniature, raised log by log out of a wilderness that had no use for kingdoms. Ezra helped her down. Garrett carried the trunk inside. Silas led the horses to the barn. She crossed the threshold of the house, and she stopped just inside the door. The room was warm. A fire had been banked in the great stone hearth. The light was the color of honey. The floor was scrubbed pine. There was a long oak table with 8 chairs around it, though she would later notice that the chair at the south end had a cushion that no one ever moved and a place setting that no one ever used. There was a rocking chair by the hearth. There were shelves of books. There was a Pennsylvania long rifle hung on pegs above the mantel. There was a Bible on a small table near the window, and the Bible was open, which meant someone read from it. And there in the corner against the north wall, beneath a window that looked out across the moonlit pasture toward the mountains, stood the piano. Square chickering rosewood, the kind built before the war. A white linen cloth had been laid over it. The cloth was fresh and clean. Someone changed it. Someone every week or every month or once a season took down the old cloth and put up a new one, because to leave a dirty cloth on the dead piano of a dead mother was a thing this house would not allow. Verity stood very still. She did not know yet that she was crying. She took off her glove. She walked across the room. She lifted the corner of the linen cloth just an inch and looked at the wood beneath. The rosewood was perfect, polished, loved. Then she lowered the cloth back into place and turned to face him. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I would like to see the room you have prepared for me. I have been on a stagecoach for 3 weeks and a sled for 9 hours, and I am not certain how much longer I can stand upright." Something passed across his face. Relief. The smallest possible smile gone before it had finished. He nodded. "Up the stairs, ma'am. First door on the right." She climbed the stairs. The room was small and clean, a 4-poster bed with a feather mattress, a washstand, a chair, a window that looked east toward the mountains. There was a quilt on the bed, blue and white sewn in the wedding ring pattern, and Verity understood without being told that this quilt had also belonged to a woman who was no longer in this house. She heard a knock on the door. It was soft, a single knock. "Yes," she said. The door did not open. Ezra Thorne spoke through it from the hallway. "Miss Brennan, there is a thing I should have said at the door and did not. I will sleep in the barn from tonight until you tell me otherwise. There is no obligation upon you of any kind that you do not wish to take on. You have 30 days. If at the end of those 30 days you wish to return to Pittsburgh, the fare will be paid and there will be nothing held against you." He paused. "I owe you one more honest thing. I did not bring you here for the reason most men bring a wife. I brought you here because my brother Silas is dying. He is not dying of any sickness a doctor could name. He is dying because 3 years ago something happened in this house that broke him, and I have watched him break a little further every winter since, and I could not watch him break through another. I thought the presence of a kind woman in this house, a good woman, might give him a reason to come back to himself. That was my reason. It was a selfish reason, and I am ashamed of it, and I owe you the truth of it tonight before you sleep under our roof." "I will not lie to you again," he said. "Good night, Miss Brennan." His footsteps went down the hall. The front door of the house opened and closed. He was going out to the barn to sleep, as he had said he would. Verity sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. A man who could have lied about why he had brought her here had chosen, in his first hour with her, to tell her the truth. She lay down on the feather mattress without undressing. She pulled the wedding ring quilt up to her chin. Through the window above the bed, she could see a single bright planet hanging over the dark shoulder of a mountain. She did not know yet that something had been buried behind this house 3 years ago, and that when she learned what it was, every wall in this house would shift on its foundations, and that she herself, Verity Brennan of Pittsburgh, 22 years old and 2 days from being a pauper, would become the small, steady fire that the Thorne brothers would finally slowly learn to warm their hands at. She slept. The morning came in gray. Verity opened her eyes to find the room cold, but not freezing. She rose, washed her face in water that had gone tepid in the basin, dressed in the second of her 2 traveling dresses, and went down the stairs. Garrett was at the stove. He had a flour sack apron tied around his waist over his trousers. The apron was incongruous on a man his size. He looked up as she came down, and his grin was wide and unforced. "Morning, ma'am. You came down at the right hour. 5 more minutes, and Silas would have eaten your share, and I tell you straight, you do not want to fight Silas for his sorghum." Across the room at the long oak table, Silas Thorne raised one eyebrow without looking up from the cup of coffee he was wrapped around. He did not smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched, and Verity understood with a small, soft surprise that this was a brother joke, that these men loved each other. "Where's your brother Ezra?" she asked. "Out at the south fence. He took the team at first light. He will be back by 9. Garrett brought her a cake of fried cornmeal as broad as her hand. He poured molasses over it from a stoneware crock. "Miss Brennan," he said, settling himself across from her with his own plate, "I am going to say a thing to you, and then I am going to leave you in peace. My brother told you last night what we brought you here for. He told you because Ezra cannot lie, but what he told you was only half the truth." Verity set down her fork. The other half is that Ezra has not slept through a winter night in 3 years. Every February, when the wind comes off the high passes and finds the cracks in this house, he gets up, he walks the rooms, he stands at the window of the room you slept in last night, which used to be our sister's room, and he looks at the mountain. I have asked him what he is looking for. He will not tell me. I think he is looking for a thing he failed to do. Garrett took a long pull of his coffee. He thought maybe a wife would help Silas. I think he was wrong about that. I think he was looking at the wrong brother. I think he was the one who needed somebody to come into this house. He just could not say it because saying it felt like betraying the dead. He stood up, he carried his plate to the wash basin, he went out the back door toward the barn, and he left her alone at the table with a cake of fried cornmeal and the truth. Verity Brennan, 22 years old, sat at the table of strangers and ate her breakfast slowly and thought about what she had been told. When Ezra Thorne came in from the south fence at 9:15, his coat caked with snow and his beard rimmed with frost, he found her at the piano in the corner of the great room. The white cloth had been folded with great care and laid across the rocking chair by the hearth. She did not turn around. She had heard him come in. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "I have decided." He stopped just inside the door. "I will stay the 30 days, she said. "At the end of the 30 days, I will tell you what I have decided. There is one condition. I will not be a guest in this house. I will earn my keep. If you have brought me here to be a kind of medicine for your brother, then I will need to know your brother, and I cannot know him if you keep me at a polite distance. That is my condition," she said. "Do you accept?" Ezra Thorne stood in the doorway with snow melting on his shoulders. His amber eyes had gone very still. Then he took off his hat. He held it against his chest. "Miss Brennan," he said, "I accept your condition. I will go further. I will tell you that in the 3 years since my sister Lenora died, no one has opened that piano. No one has folded that cloth. No one has spoken her name at this table without flinching. You walked into this house 9 hours ago. You have been awake for 1 hour. And you have already done a thing none of us could do." "A man keeps his word," he said, "so I will keep mine. You will not be a guest. You will be what you make yourself in this house." Then he said, "Welcome, Miss Brennan, to the Thorne place." Outside on the high ridge above the homestead, a hawk turned slowly in the cold blue October air, and far to the north, behind the wall of the Bitterroots, the storm that would change everything was beginning very quietly to gather its first breath. Verity Brennan of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, lifted the cover of the keys, set her right hand carefully on middle C, and pressed. The note rang through the great room like the first bell of a long-awaited Sunday morning. It hung in the warm, honeyed air. It traveled through the open kitchen door into the yard. It crossed the snow to the wood shop, where a young man with slate-gray eyes lifted his head from his work for the first time in 3 years and listened. Inside the barn, a man who had spent the night on a pile of horse blankets stood up slowly and walked to the door and opened it just an inch and listened. In the kitchen, an apron-clad brother went still over the wash basin and closed his eyes. The note faded. Verity lifted her hand. She did not play another. Not yet. That was enough for the first morning. That was the beginning. The first weeks of November settled over the Bitterroot Valley with the slow inevitability of a rising tide. Verity learned the small, particular silences of the Thorne house, the way the floorboards in the upstairs hall creaked under Ezra's weight at 4 in the morning when he rose to start the kitchen fire, the way Garrett hummed under his breath when he kneaded biscuit dough, the way Silas could move from the wood shop to the back porch without any sound at all, as though he had been raised by deer. Garrett showed her the milking. The cow was a broad red roan named Bessie. "You do not pull, ma'am," he said. "You squeeze from the top down." By the end of the first week, she was bringing in a half pail before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. Ezra showed her the horses. There were 4 of them in the barn. The 2 heavy bay drafts named Pilot and Compass, who pulled the sled and the wagon, a buckskin gelding named Treaty, who was Ezra's own horse, and an old blood bay mare named Daisy, who had belonged to the brother's mother. "Daisy is yours to ride if you wish it," Ezra said on the 3rd morning. "She has not been ridden in 3 years, and she is 15 now, but she has a soft mouth and a good temper, and she will not throw you." He did not say whose horse Daisy had been before. He did not need to. Verity had not ridden a horse in her life. She told him so. Ezra looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Then I will teach you in the spring. The trails are too hard now, but come spring, if you are still here, you will ride. If you are still here." He said it the way another man might have said, "Please." Silas taught her nothing. Silas was the one who hung at the edge of every room. He came to meals and ate what was put in front of him and rose and went back to the wood shop without a word. Silas was the one whose plate was always cleaner than the others because he ate small portions and ate them quickly, and Verity began to understand within the first week that Silas Thorne was a man who took only as much food as he believed he had earned, and that he believed he had not earned very much. She did not press him. She had a habit of paying attention to people in pain. She watched. On the 7th evening, Verity left her own door unbolted for the first time. She did not look in the morning to see if the bolt had been touched. She knew in the way one knows the weather that no one had touched it and that no one would. The first real conversation she had with Ezra Thorne happened on a Sunday afternoon in the 2nd week of November. Garrett had taken the wagon to the trading post at Fort Benton. Silas was in the wood shop. Verity had been kneading bread on the long oak table when she looked up and saw Ezra standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand. "I am going up to the south pasture to walk the line," he said. "The walk is 2 miles up and 2 miles back. If you would care for the air, you are welcome." She wiped the flour from her hands on her apron and said yes before she had thought about it. They walked along a track that ran south from the house between 2 split rail fences that had silvered with weather. For the first half mile, neither of them spoke. Ezra walked at her left shoulder, his stride shortened to match hers, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture she would later realize he had learned in the army. "Mr. Thorne," she said at last. "May I ask you a question?" "You may ask," he said. "Where did you serve?" He did not stop walking. The rhythm of his stride did not change, but the sweep of his eyes paused for one full beat at the tree line before it resumed. "Pennsylvania," he said, 1863. "I was in the 69th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. We were on a low ridge called Cemetery Ridge for 3 days at the beginning of July. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, 15,000 men came across an open field at us. There was a low stone wall in front of us that was not as tall as your knee. The wall was where the line broke for a few minutes. I was at the wall. You were 16, she said. She had done the arithmetic. I was 15, he said. I had given a different age at enlistment. The scar at your temple, she said. Was that the wall? It was the wall, he said. The butt of a rifle swung sideways. The man who swung it did not survive the afternoon. I did. I have not in the 16 years since found a satisfactory reason for that, and I have stopped looking for one. There is another scar across my back, ma'am, from a bayonet I did not see coming, but that one I do not speak of even to my brothers. He glanced at her then for the first time since they had started walking. His amber eyes were steady. I tell you this, Miss Brennan, because you asked and because you are owed honest answers in this house. I do not speak of it often. I would prefer it not be spoken of at the table. I will not speak of it, she said. Thank you. They walked another quarter mile in silence. The trail bent west around a stand of aspens whose leaves had gone gold and fallen and lay in drifts ankle deep on the path. Ezra stooped without breaking stride and picked up a single perfect aspen leaf and handed it to her. He did not say anything when he did it. He simply gave her the leaf and walked on. She put the leaf in the pocket of her coat. She would press it that evening between the pages of the Bible by the front window, and it would still be there 40 years later when her great-granddaughter found it while looking for the family record of births and deaths. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "the grave on the ridge, the one we passed in the sled, that is not your mother." Ezra Thorne stopped walking. For a long moment he stood with his back to her, looking up the line of the fence toward the dark line of the pines. Then he turned, he looked at her. "No," he said quietly, "it is not. I will not ask who," she said. "I only wanted to know that you would not lie to me a second time." "I will not," he said. "When the time comes that you are owed that name, you will hear it, not before." I am sorry, Miss Brennan. The lie was the first night. It was a thing I have told strangers for 3 years, and it came out of my mouth before I thought. You are not a stranger. I should not have said it. I am a stranger," she said gently. "I have been here 12 days. He looked at her with something very close to a smile. "You are a stranger who folded the cloth on my mother's piano in the first hour. You are not the kind of stranger I meant." They turned at the leaning rail of the south fence. Halfway down the long slope toward the house, Verity spoke again. "Mr. Thorne, why do you call me Miss Brennan?" He glanced at her sidelong. "It is the proper form," he said. "You wrote in your letter that you would be honest with me. I am asking honestly." He considered it as he walked. He considered it for nearly 100 yards, because he said at last, "Calling you anything else would be a thing I have not yet earned. I will not assume." "Then call me Verity," she said, "when we are alone. Miss Brennan in front of the brothers, if you prefer. But when we are alone, I would like to be called by my name. I have not heard my own name spoken aloud by another person in 2 months." Ezra Thorne walked another 20 paces before he answered. "Verity," he said, that was all. He said her name once, the way a man tests the temperature of water with one finger before he steps in. And then they walked the rest of the way down to the house in a silence that was, for the first time, the kind of silence two people share rather than the kind two people endure. The piano became hers in slow degrees. In the second week, she began to play short hymns in the late afternoons. Her father had taught her the old, simple Methodist tunes. The first time Garrett came in from the woodpile and heard her playing, he stopped on the back step and stood there with an armload of split cedar for a full 3 minutes before he came inside. In the third week, she began to play in the evenings after the supper dishes had been cleared. The first evening, she played Silas Thorne, who had been about to rise from the table and return to the woodshop, sat back down. He did not look at her. He did not speak. He sat with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and he listened to her play 3 hymns and a slow Stephen Foster ballad that her father had loved, and then he rose without a word and went out the back door. The next evening she played again. Silas stayed for 5 hymns. The evening after that, when she sat down at the piano, she found a small object on the closed lid that had not been there in the morning. It was a wooden hair comb, no longer than her hand, carved from a piece of pale sugar pine. The teeth were perfectly even. The handle was carved with a spray of mountain laurel, the leaves overlapping the small 5-pointed flowers, worked so finely that she could see the stamens. She did not ask who had left it. She knew. She lifted it carefully, turned it once in the lamplight, and tucked it into her hair above her left ear. When she sat down to play, Silas Thorne was already at the table with his coffee. He did not look at the comb. But when she rose at the end of the evening and bid the brothers good night, he looked at her face briefly for the first time since she had arrived, and he said in a voice rougher than she had heard him use before, "Sleep well, Miss Brennan." It was the first sentence he had spoken directly to her in 19 days. She climbed the stairs to her room, and she sat down on the edge of the bed, and she let the tears come for the first time since Pittsburgh. And they were good tears, the kind that do not exhaust a person, but rather wash them clean. Ezra began to sleep in the house the following evening. He did not announce it. He simply did not go out to the barn after supper. He banked the fire in the hearth, took down a heavy bedroll from a shelf in the back hallway, and laid it on the long bench by the kitchen stove. The first time he called her by her name in front of the brothers was the morning of the 23rd day. "Verity, the snow on the north slope has turned to ice. I would not walk to the smokehouse this morning without taking the long way around." Garrett at the stove did not turn his head, but he smiled into the oatmeal pot. Silas at the table lifted his eyes from his coffee for 1/4 of a second and looked across at his elder brother with an expression Verity could not read, and then he looked down again. 3 men had heard a name spoken at this table that had not been spoken at this table in 3 years, and the room had survived it, and the world had not ended, and the empty chair at the south end of the table had not, after all, fallen through the floor. That afternoon, the wind shifted to the northwest, and Mrs. Cora Whitfield came down the trail from the next homestead 3 miles up the valley with a basket of cider apples. Mrs. Whitfield was 64 years old. She was a widow of the rough frontier kind. She had iron gray hair pinned tight to her skull, and a face like a saddle that had been left out in too many summers, and a pair of kind, shrewd brown eyes that took in a kitchen at one glance and missed nothing. She and Verity sat at the kitchen table with cups of strong tea while the brothers were out at the wood. Mrs. Whitfield ate two of her own apples and looked at Verity over the rim of her cup, and then she said without preamble, "How much have they told you, child?" Verity set down her cup carefully. "About what, ma'am?" "About the girl on the ridge." The room was very still. The clock above the mantel ticked. "I know there is a girl," Verity said. "I do not yet know her name." "Lenora," said Mrs. Whitfield. "Lenora Marie Thorne. 16 years old when she died. She was the youngest of the four Thorne children and the only daughter, and she was as lovely a young woman as ever drew breath in this valley. She had hair the color of polished walnut and a laugh you could hear from 2 pastures away. The story, the one the brothers tell at the trading post, is that she was thrown from a horse in the spring of '77 and broke her neck on a stall post." Verity waited. "That is not what happened," said Mrs. Cora Whitfield. "There was a man involved, the eldest son of one of the big land outfits over the divide, a young man named Crane. He came riding into this yard on an afternoon when the brothers were all gone to a horse sale at Fort Shaw. Lenora was alone in this house. What exactly happened in the next 2 hours? No one living knows for certain, except that Silas Thorne came back early because his horse had thrown a shoe, and that he found his sister dead in the stall of the barn, and that he beat the Crane boy half to death with the handle of a hay rake before Garrett rode in and pulled him off. The Crane boy lived. He has a limp and a scar across his face, and he does not come into this country anymore. His father, however, is a man named Bartholomew Crane, and Bartholomew Crane is a man who does not let go of a thing." Mrs. Whitfield set down her cup. "There was a trial for what Silas did to the Crane boy. The Thornes won it. They won it because old Mr. Tully, who was the shepherd on the upper allotment, had seen the Crane boy ride into the yard alone, and his testimony settled the matter. But the Thornes spent everything they had to win that trial. They came out of it free men with a homestead mortgaged to the second log." Verity's hands had gone very still around her cup. "The mortgage," she said, "held by the Helena Bank." Or it was held by the Helena Bank. There has been talk in the past month that someone has been buying old paper out of that bank. I do not know for certain who is doing the buying, child, but I have lived in this country for 30 years, and I know the smell of a man like Bartholomew Crane when he begins to circle. "Why are you telling me this, ma'am?" Verity said. Mrs. Cora Whitfield reached across the table and laid her weathered hand over Verity's young one. "Because she said you have been in that house for 24 days, and I came down here today to bring apples and look at you, and I have looked at you, and you have the steady eyes of a woman who is going to stay. The Thornes are good men. They are the best men in this valley, but they are going to need you, child, in ways they do not yet know. Silas Thorne is not dying of his sister. Silas Thorne is dying of being the one who came home and saw it. The cure for that is being seen by someone who is not afraid of the seeing. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," said Verity. "I think I do." Mrs. Whitfield kissed Verity once on the forehead the way a grandmother kisses a girl she has decided to claim, and she went out the kitchen door and back up the trail toward her own homestead. Verity sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. She rose, she walked to the great room, she lifted the cover from the keys of the piano, she sat down on the bench. She did not play a hymn. She played instead a small, simple lullaby in C major, the one her father had taught her when she was 4. She played it slowly. She played it twice. When she lifted her hands from the keys, she heard a sound behind her that she had never heard in this house before. It was the sound of a man weeping. She did not turn around. She did not look. She kept her hands in her lap and her eyes on the keys, and she listened as Silas Thorne, who had come in from the wood shop at some point in the second verse and stood in the doorway, wept quietly into his sleeve at the threshold of the room. He did not come further in. He did not speak. After a long time, the sound stopped, and she heard the door close softly, and she heard his bootsteps cross the porch and go back across the yard to the wood shop. Through the great room window, she could see the first thin flakes of the next storm beginning to fall slanting in from the northwest. The storm that began that afternoon did not break for 4 days. It came down out of the northwest in long, slow waves, the kind of weather the old trappers in the valley called a sitting storm, the kind that does not run through a country but rather lies down on it. By the second morning, the snow was up to the porch rail. By the third morning, it had buried the bottom panes of the kitchen windows. Verity, sitting in the rocker with her sewing in her lap, listened to Ezra read aloud from a book of Walt Whitman that had belonged to his mother. He read the way some men sing, without performance, without flourish. The poem he was reading was the long one about the lilacs and the fallen captain, and he read it through to the end without his voice changing once. And when he closed the book, he did not look up at her, and she did not look at him, and the room held the two of them in the way a cupped hand holds water. It was the fifth night of the storm, late after Garrett had gone up to bed and Ezra had laid himself down on the kitchen bench with his blanket, that Verity heard the front door of the house open and close. She was already awake. She knew before she rose from her bed which one it was. She lit her candle. She pulled on her wool stockings and the heaviest of her two dresses. She went down the hall and down the stairs. The kitchen bench was empty. Ezra Thorne was already pulling on his boots by the front door. And the look he turned on her as she came down was the look of a man who has been afraid of a particular thing for 3 years and has just heard it walk past him. He went, Ezra said. His voice was low and very calm. He went toward the ridge. The grave, Verity said. She did not waste words. She crossed the room to the row of pegs by the door, and she took down a heavy buffalo robe coat that was too large for her, the one that had hung there unworn for 3 years, and she put it on without asking. Ezra, lacing his boots, watched her without comment. He understood in the same way she understood that there were things about Silas Thorne that one woman in this valley might be able to reach tonight that no brother could. "We will need a lantern," he said, too, "and the rope." "I will carry the rope," she said. Garrett came down the stairs 3 minutes later with his rifle and his coat already on. "How long?" "Maybe a quarter hour," said Ezra. "Then we go now," said Garrett. "The trail he made will be filling." They went out into a wind that could pull the breath from a person's mouth before they could finish a word. The lanterns were small yellow eyes in a vast white nothing. It was a quarter mile to the foot of the ridge and another quarter mile up the long shoulder of it to the painted white fence. The wind worked at them the whole way. Verity could not feel her hands by the time they reached the top. Silas was kneeling inside the fence. He had no coat. He had walked out of the house in his shirt and his trousers and his boots. He had no hat. The snow had begun to gather on his shoulders and in his hair, and in the lantern light his bare hands lay open and empty on his knees, palms up on the snow, above the small mounded place where his sister had been laid in 1877. Ezra stopped at the gate of the fence. He did not go in. Verity understood that Ezra Thorne had not crossed that little white fence since the day they had buried her, that this was Silas's place to enter and Silas's place alone. She unwrapped the buffalo robe coat from her shoulders. She handed her lantern to Garrett without looking at him. She walked past Ezra and through the gate and across the small enclosed snow, and she knelt in front of Silas Thorne, and she put the heavy coat around his shoulders and drew the collar of it up to his throat with her own bare hands. "Silas," she said. He did not lift his head. "Silas," she said again, "look at me." He lifted his head. In the lantern light from beyond the fence, his slate gray eyes were red-rimmed and entirely without resistance. He had used himself up. "You are going to die out here," she said quietly. "Not tonight. We are going to take you home tonight. But if you keep coming up here in the dark by yourself, you are going to die out here one of these winters, and your brothers are going to find you, and that is a thing they cannot survive. So you are going to come down off this ridge with me right now, and we are going to put you by the fire, and you are going to tell me what happened, the whole of it, tonight." He stared at her. His mouth opened once and closed. "I killed her," he said. His voice was a dry whisper. "You did not," said Verity Brennan. "I came home," he said. "I came home, and I came up to the barn, and the door was open, and she was on the floor of the stall, and her neck was wrong, and there was a man standing over her, and he was breathing hard. And I did not go to her first. I did not go to my sister first. I went to him. I picked up the hay rake handle, and I went to him, and I hit him, and I hit him, and I hit him, and Garrett pulled me off. And by the time Garrett pulled me off, she had been alone for I do not know how many minutes, and she was already gone, and I had not held her hand. I had not held her hand. She would have died anyway," he said. The doctor said. "Her neck. She would have. But I did not hold her hand. She was 16 years old, and she died on the floor of a barn while I was 3 feet away beating a man, and not one of us ever spoke of it because there was nothing to say." Verity took his cold, bare hands in hers. She pressed them between her own. "You did not kill your sister. A man named Crane killed your sister. You came home to a brother's nightmare, and you did the thing your body did, which was the thing any older brother of any sister anywhere in this country would have done. You are not guilty of her death. You are guilty of one thing. You are guilty of being the one who saw it. That is not a sin, Silas. That is a wound. A wound is not a sin." He was looking at her face in the lantern light as though he had not seen another human face in a long time and was now seeing one. I cannot give you back the minute you did not hold her hand, Verity said. No one can. But I can tell you this. I have been in your house for 27 days. I have watched your brothers carry you. I have watched them set a place for you at every meal. I have watched Ezra leave a lamp burning in your shop every night because he could not stand for you to come home in the dark. They love you, Silas. They love you the way men love who do not have the word for it. And every winter you come up here alone in the night, and you give a little more of yourself to this hill, and one of these winters there will not be enough of you to bring back, and they cannot survive that. Then come down off this ridge, she said. Come down with me now, and you are going to live, Silas Thorne. You are going to live because 3 good men love you, and a 4th one is going to start, and I am the 4th one. He bowed his head against her shoulder. She put her arms around him, the buffalo robe and the snow and all, and she held him while the wind moved across the ridge above them, and she felt the awful, long, slow sob go out of his chest, the sob he had been holding since 1877, and she did not loosen her arms until it was finished. When he lifted his head, his eyes were clear. Stand up, Silas, she said. He stood, his legs shook. They turned together and they walked slowly out through the gate of the little white fence. Ezra Thorne, on the other side of the gate, had been weeping silently into his sleeve for what Verity guessed was the first time since Pennsylvania. He did not say anything when they came through. Silas Thorne slept that night by the hearth on a pile of 3 quilts and the buffalo robe. Garrett built up the fire to a roar and sat in the rocking chair with his rifle across his knees. Ezra stood at the front door with his hand on the latch for an hour before he came away from it. He came at last to the long bench by the kitchen stove, and he sat down on it, and he put his face in his hands. Verity, who had been standing at the kitchen counter slicing bread because she did not know what else to do, set down the knife and walked across the kitchen and laid her hand very lightly on the back of his bowed head. She left her hand there for perhaps 10 seconds. She felt him shudder once, all the way through, the way a horse shudders when a saddle blanket is finally lifted off after a hard day. Then she took her hand away. When she looked up again, he was looking at her across the kitchen with his amber eyes very clear and very steady, and he said in a voice low enough that the brother by the hearth would not hear Verity, I owe you something. I do not know how to begin to pay. You owe me nothing, she said. You owe me to keep going. The snow stopped at dawn. The sky cleared, the sun came up across the eastern ridge and laid itself out long and gold across a country that had been, for one night, a country no one in it could navigate alone. In the days that followed, the house was different. Silas began to come to the table and stay through the meal. He began to take a second helping. Once on the morning of the 3rd day after the ridge, he asked Garrett to pass the molasses, and the request was so ordinary that Garrett's hand jerked when he reached for the crock, and the crock landed on its side, and the brothers all 3 burst out laughing. That afternoon, Ezra Thorne moved Lenora's chair. He simply lifted the chair from the south end of the table where it had been set since the day of the funeral, carried it across the great room, and placed it carefully against the wall beside the piano where it would catch the late afternoon light through the south window. He did not throw it out. He moved it 12 feet to a place where it could be seen and remembered, and where the table itself could finally close its long, open wound. When he turned around, Verity was watching him from the kitchen doorway with a dishcloth in her hand. I should have done that 2 years ago, he said. You did it today, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and he went out to the barn, and Verity heard him split kindling for 40 minutes in the cold yellow afternoon, the steady ringing sound of a single axe in a single rhythm. The first week of January, Ezra Thorne began to mend the small things. He started with the north window of the great room, the one that had whistled in every storm for as long as Verity had been in the house. He warmed a small lump of beeswax and pine tar in a tin cup over the stove until it was soft, and he worked the seal into the gap of the frame with his thumb slowly, the way a man kneads the haunches of a horse he is gentling. The whistling stopped. The room went quiet in a new way, the way a room goes quiet when a small old pain has been listened to and answered. The next morning, he knelt beside the long oak table where the family had been eating in silence for 5 years, and he turned the table on its side, and he examined the south leg, the one that had been a half-inch short since the spring of '74, when his father had set the table down too hard on a flagstone. The leg had wobbled at every meal of every day for 5.5 years, and the family had grown so accustomed to it that they no longer felt it. Ezra pulled a scrap of seasoned pine from his pocket. He took out his skinning knife. He sat cross-legged on the great room floor and shaved the wood in slow, precise strokes, the long curls falling like blonde hair onto the boards. And he tested the wedge against the leg and shaved it again and tested it again. And on the third try, he tapped the wedge home with the heel of his hand, and he set the table back upright, and he pressed both palms down on the surface, and the table did not move. Verity was watching from the kitchen doorway with a flour cloth in her hands. She had not moved in 15 minutes. She understood in that 15 minutes that Ezra Thorne was not mending a window or a table. He was mending the small forgotten wounds of a house that had been holding its breath for 3 winters. He was telling each piece of the building one at a time that it was permitted now to relax. That evening, when Ezra came in from the barn for supper, Verity met him at the door with a clean towel for his hands. He took it without a word. He looked down at her, and the amber of his eyes in the lamplight held a thing she had not yet seen there, a thing very close to peace. "You have done enough, Ezra," she said quietly, his hand stilled on the towel. What I mean," she said, "is that you do not owe me one more nail. You do not owe this house one more thing. You have given enough. If I am still here at the end of the 30 days, it will not be because you have earned me by mending. It will be because I have decided the mending is for you, not for me." He stood with the towel in his hands for a long moment. Then he said very low, "A man keeps his word, Verity, and the word I gave this house is older than 30 days. I will keep mending while there is light to mend by. You are not the reason. You are only the fact of it." He walked past her into the kitchen, and Verity stood at the door alone for a moment, and she pressed her hand against the door frame where his shoulder had passed, and she felt her breath come strangely short, and she thought in the way a woman thinks who has begun to understand a thing without yet allowing herself the word for it. "He has not been mending the house at all. He has been building me a place to stay." The wolves came on the last night of January. It was a hard winter for them. The deer had moved low into the river bottoms early, and the snow on the high meadows had crusted over so that the elk could not paw through to the grass beneath. And a pack of 7 gray wolves that had hunted the upper Bitterroot all autumn had begun by the 3rd week of January to drift down toward the smell of cattle and horses. The Thorns had heard them on 3 nights calling along the ridge above the homestead, the long, thin howl that mountain men know is not a song, but a counting the wolves checking their numbers in the dark. On the night of the 31st, the pack came down to the barn. Ezra heard them first. He had been sleeping on the kitchen bench as he had slept for 2 months, and he sat up at the same instant the first horse screamed. Garrett was already on the stairs by the time Ezra had pulled on his boots. Silas came up from the great room with the Pennsylvania long rifle already in his hands. Verity, on the upstairs landing in her nightdress and shawl, asked one question, which was, "How many?" "7," said Ezra. "Stay in the house. Bolt the door behind us. There is a second rifle by the hearth and a powder flask on the mantel. If anything that is not us comes onto that porch, you do not open the door for any reason." She did not argue. She bolted the door behind them. She took the second rifle from above the hearth, and she sat in the rocking chair facing the door, and she kept the rifle across her knees, and she listened. What she heard for the next 30 minutes was the worst sound she had ever heard, the shrieking of horses, the wet, snarling roar of wolves. 3 rifle shots, then 4, then a long pause, then 2 more. Garrett shouting something she could not make out. Once, terribly, the high, sharp sound of a man crying out in pain, and she did not know which brother it was, and she stood up from the rocker with the rifle in her hands, and she made herself sit back down, because Ezra had said, "Stay in the house," and she had told herself the night she had come down off the ridge with Silas that she would never again be a woman who only watched. The shooting stopped, the snarling stopped, a long moment of silence, then bootsteps on the porch, Garrett's voice low and urgent calling her name. She unbolted the door. They had Silas between them. He could walk, but barely. There was a long, deep tear down the outside of his left calf where a wolf had taken him in the second pass through the barn, and the blood had soaked his trouser leg from the knee to the boot. His face was white. Garrett's coat was torn at the shoulder, but the skin under it was unbroken. Ezra had a bruise rising along his jaw where the butt of his own rifle had kicked him when he had fired one-handed at a wolf already on top of his brother. "6 are dead in the yard," Garrett said. "The 7th ran. He will not come back." Verity did not waste a second. "Get him to the table," she said. "Garrett the lamp, Ezra the kettle. I will need the whiskey from the high shelf and the sewing box from beside the rocker. Now." She had never stitched a wound before. She had stitched torn quilts and frayed cuffs. The principle was the same. She washed the wound with whiskey while Silas gripped the edge of the table so hard the oak creaked under his hands. She threaded the finest needle she had with strong waxed linen thread. She pulled the edges of the tear together and she set the first stitch. It took her a quarter hour. Silas did not cry out once. Garrett held the lamp. Ezra stood at his brother's head with one hand flat on his brother's chest, and he murmured something Verity could not hear, the way a man murmurs to a horse in a thunderstorm. When she tied off the last stitch and bandaged the leg with strips of clean linen, she sat back on her heels and her hands began to shake for the first time, and Ezra reached down without a word and took both of her hands in his and held them until they were still. She has saved him, Garrett said quietly to no one. Twice now. She has saved him twice. Ezra did not let go of her hands. He looked at her across his brother's bandaged leg, and his amber eyes in the lamplight had gone past whatever he had been holding back for 2 months, and he said very low, so that only she could hear Verity, when this is over, when the leg is healed, when the spring comes, you and I are going to have a conversation. About staying, I know, she said. He squeezed her hands once. He let them go. Outside in the moonlight on the snow of the yard, 6 gray wolves lay where they had fallen, and the 7th was running west across the frozen pasture and would not be seen in that valley again. Inside the house, 4 people were alive, all 4 of them. That was the night Verity would remember later, when the word family stopped being a thing she was using to describe the Thorns and became a thing that included her. The first letter from a man named Augustus Pendleton arrived on the 7th of February. It was carried up the trail by a young rider from Fort Benton who had been paid $2 to bring it. The rider would not stay for coffee. He handed Ezra the envelope at the door, took $2 from Garrett for his trouble, and rode out before the Thorn brothers had even broken the seal. The letter was brief. It was on the heavy cream stationery of a Helena law office. It informed Ezra Thorne, head of household, that the promissory note dated April 14th, 1877, in the original principal amount of $3,000 formerly held by the First Territorial Bank of Helena, had been assigned by purchase to a private party, said party preferring to remain unnamed at this stage, and that all outstanding principal and accrued interest was now called due in full no later than the 8th of March of the present year, in default of which the lien upon the homestead and improvements at the registered Bitterroot allotment would be foreclosed pursuant to territorial law. The letter was signed Augustus J. Pendleton, attorney at law. Garrett read it after Ezra. Silas read it after Garrett. Verity, standing at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the oak, read it last. $3,000, she said quietly. $3,000, said Ezra. By the 8th of March, said Garrett. That is a fortnight short of a month. Verity looked from face to face. She saw Ezra's jaw set. She saw Garrett for the first time since she had known him, with no smile in him at all. She saw Silas, who had sat back down at the table, lift his eyes and say in a voice that was no longer the whisper of a broken man, but something altogether new, "We are going to lose the place. We are not," said Verity. All 3 brothers turned to look at her. She did not yet know how she knew it. She knew only that she had walked off a stagecoach into nothing 4 months ago and had been given a roof, and that she had sat by a grave in a blizzard and had been given a brother, and that she was not going to stand in this kitchen and watch the men who had given her these things lose the ground their father had cleared with his own hands. She thought of the cameo at her throat. She thought of the small carved boxes on the high shelf in the woodshop, sugar pine and walnut and red cedar, 3 years of them never sold, never seen by any eyes but the eyes of the man who had made them. "I have an idea," she said. "I do not yet know if it will work, but I have an idea, and I will need a piece of paper and the use of the kitchen table, and I will need Silas Thorne to come down from his shop tomorrow morning at first light, and I will need all 3 of you to listen to me, and I will need you to trust me in this. Can you do that?" "Yes," said Ezra Thorne. "Yes," said Garrett. "Yes," said Silas. And his yes was the steadiest of the 3. The plan came together over the course of a single long evening. Verity had remembered in the small hours of the night after the letter arrived the name of a man her father had played piano for once at a Christmas dinner in Pittsburgh in 1871. The man's name was Cornelius Ashby. He was a partner in a furniture house in St. Louis that supplied the parlors of the rising merchant families along the Mississippi from Cairo to Minneapolis, and he had a particular weakness for fine American cabinet work. He had said to her father over the dessert with a glass of port in his hand, "Mr. Brennan, the trouble with our trade in this country is that we have run out of old country joinery and have not yet learned to value our own. The wood is here, the hands are here, they simply have not found one another." Verity had been 13 years old at that dinner. She had remembered the man's name, and she had remembered the name of his firm, Ashby and Beale, and she had remembered the address. She wrote to him on the morning of the 8th of February. The letter went out by the same writer who had brought Pendleton's. She paid him $1 of her own money. While she wrote, Silas Thorne stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hand and watched her. And when she sealed the letter with a drop of candle wax, she looked up and met his eyes, and she said, "Silas, I have one question for you, and I need you to answer it honestly. Can you, between today and the 1st of March, build me 12 pieces of furniture?" Silas Thorne, who had not asked for an order or accepted a commission since the spring of 1877, looked at the woman across the kitchen table and said in a voice that was at last entirely steady, "How fine! The finest you have ever made," said Verity, "and I will need a sample piece, your best, ready to ride east on the next coach. We will not get a second chance at this." Silas Thorne nodded once. He set his coffee cup down on the table. He turned and he walked out of the kitchen and across the yard, and he went into his wood shop, and the lamp in the wood shop window came on, and it did not go out except for the 4 hours of sleep he allowed himself each night for the next 20 days. Outside, a thin, warm wind had begun very faintly to blow down from the southwest. Ezra Thorne stood on the porch with his coat unbuttoned for the first time since November, and he watched the smoke from the woodshop chimney rise straight and thin into the cold blue evening, and he understood that the woman in his kitchen had in 3 months done a thing he had not been able to do in 3 years. She had given his brother back a reason to work past dawn. The 20 days that followed were the most disciplined work the Thorne homestead had seen in 5 years. Silas slept in the woodshop. He came to the house only for meals and for 2 hours of true sleep before dawn, and the rest of the time he was at the bench or at the lathe or at the long sanding table where he polished the work with rabbit skin until the wood took on the soft glow of butter held to firelight. He built a sample piece first, a small writing desk of walnut and bird's eye maple, the front a folding leaf that opened to reveal 6 pigeonholes inlaid with a pattern of mountain laurel leaves. Verity carried the desk to the window in the great room when it was finished and stood looking at it for a long time, and then she said to the silent man who had built it, "Silas, this is the desk a senator's daughter will write her wedding letters at, and she will not know the name of the man who made it, but her grandchildren will keep it, and her great-grandchildren will keep it, and that is what we are sending to St. Louis." Silas looked at the desk. He looked at her. He nodded once. He said, "Then I will do better on the next 11." The desk went out on the coach, east on the 18th of February. The reply came back on the 2nd of March. Verity opened it with her hands shaking. The letter was in the hand of Cornelius Ashby himself. It was 4 lines long. "Miss Brennan, I have your sample. I will be at Fort Benton on the 7th of March. I will pay $350 for the desk and $300 apiece for any other piece of comparable workmanship up to a contracted total. I will travel with bank drafts. Yours, C. Ashby." Verity sat down in the rocking chair by the hearth, and she put her face in her hands, and she laughed for a full minute, and then she wiped her cornflower blue eyes, and she stood up, and she walked across the yard to the wood shop, and she opened the door, and she said, "Silas, he is coming, and he is paying." Silas Thorne, who had not slept more than 4 hours and 20 nights, turned slowly from the lathe, and a smile spread across his face that was the smile of a man waking up from a long bad dream into a morning he had begun to believe would never come, and he said the only thing he said all that long afternoon, "I will have all 12 of them ready." He had 10 finished. 2 were on the bench. Garrett brought the wagon around at first light on the 6th of March. It took the 4 of them all morning to load the wagon, the pieces wrapped in old quilts and packed in straw, the desk, a high-backed rocking chair, a pair of side tables with carved aprons, a blanket chest of red cedar with brass fittings, a folding screen of 3 panels worked in pierced fretwork, a washstand, a chest of drawers, a dressing table with a hinged mirror frame, a pair of candle stands, a small bookcase with leaded glass doors that Silas had cut and set in himself. 12 pieces, $300 apiece on the lowest count was $3,600. Verity rode on the wagon seat between Ezra and Garrett. Silas rode behind on the buckskin because he could not bear to let the wagon out of his sight. The Chinook had come in 2 days before, and the trail was running in places with snow melt, and the wagon wheels cut deep ruts through the slush, and the brothers walked beside the team for the worst of the steep grades to take the weight off the horses. They reached Fort Benton on the afternoon of the 7th. Cornelius Ashby was a small, bald man of 60 in a black broadcloth coat. He stood at the door of the trading post with his hat in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other, and when the wagon came up the rutted street, he walked to it without a word and lifted the corner of the first quilt and looked at the rocking chair beneath it and said in a voice gone soft, with the surprise of a man who had not expected to be surprised, "Mr. Thorne, I have been in this trade for 30 years. I have never seen a piece of frontier work this fine. Where were you trained?" Silas Thorne, sitting on the buckskin with his hat pushed back, looked down at the small, bald man of business who had ridden 2,000 miles to see his work, and he said the first complete sentence he had spoken to a stranger in 3 years. "I was trained in my father's shop. He died in 73. I have made nothing worth selling since the spring of 77. Cornelius Ashby looked at him for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Sir, you have made 12 things worth selling in the last 3 weeks. May I have them all?" The contract was signed on the back of the wagon. Ashby paid in bank drafts on the First National of St. Louis, $3,600 in total, with a verbal agreement for an ongoing arrangement, 4 pieces a month at the same rate beginning after the spring thaw. He shook Silas's hand. He shook Ezra's hand. He bowed to Verity over her glove the way men in Pittsburgh had bowed to her mother 20 years before. They rode home with the bank drafts folded inside Ezra's vest against his ribs, and Verity did not stop looking at the road behind them the whole way down the valley, because she had begun in the last 10 days to expect a thing she could not yet name, and it was coming. It came the next morning. They were 3 miles short of the homestead in the narrow place where the trail bent around the shoulder of a granite outcropping when 4 horsemen came down the slope above the trail and blocked the road in front of them. 2 more came up the trail behind, cutting them off. 6 men, all armed, all wearing the long oilskin dusters of professional range hands. None of them were Bartholomew Crane himself. Crane was a man who hired this kind of work done. The leader of the 6 was a thin, sandy-haired man with a pistol drawn and resting across his saddle bow. He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "we will trouble you for the bank drafts you took at Fort Benton yesterday." Ezra and Garrett were already drawing. Silas, on the buckskin behind the wagon, had the long rifle out and across his thighs. Verity, on the wagon seat, did not move her hands. She was looking past the leader of the 6 at the small ridge behind him and at the trail that ran up over that ridge toward Helena, and she was thinking very fast. "Sirs," she said, her voice carried clear down the road, "I would like to speak before any man here fires a weapon. May I?" The leader looked at her. The amusement in his face shifted slightly into curiosity. "Speak, ma'am." She stood up on the wagon seat. She did not raise the cameo at her throat. She did not raise her voice. "You have come up here," she said, "on the orders of a man named Bartholomew Crane. I do not need you to confirm that. I will tell you what I know, and you will measure it against what your employer has told you. 3 days ago, I sent a letter, and yesterday at Fort Benton, I received the reply from Mr. Henry Caldwell, the senior examiner of the Helena banking circuit. Mr. Caldwell has been investigating Mr. Crane's purchases of distressed paper for the past 9 months. There is a federal warrant being prepared at this hour in the territorial courthouse. Mr. Crane's own lawyer, Mr. Augustus Pendleton, gave a sworn statement on the 2nd of this month in exchange for immunity. By the time you ride back over that ridge with our money, Mr. Crane will be in custody, and any man who took money from him this week will be standing before a federal judge by the end of the month." She paused. "I am not threatening you, gentlemen," she said. "I am telling you the way the wind is blowing. Mr. Crane cannot pay you what he promised you. He cannot pay anyone. The First Territorial Bank has frozen his accounts as of the close of business yesterday. If you ride home now, you ride home as range hands who took a hard winter job and walked away when the man who hired you turned out to be a fraud. If you fire on this wagon, you ride home as outlaws, and you do not ride home for very long." The trail was very quiet. Somewhere up in the pines, a Steller's jay called once. The leader of the 6 men sat his horse and looked at Verity Brennan for a long count of perhaps 15 seconds. Then he glanced at the man to his left, and the man to his left glanced at the man behind him, and Verity saw the calculation move through them like wind through grass, and the leader laughed once short and tired, and he holstered his pistol. "Boys," he said, "we are going home." He looked back at Verity. "Ma'am, you are either telling the truth or you are the coolest liar I have met in 20 years on this side of the divide. Either way, I am not getting paid enough today to find out which." He touched the brim of his hat to her. He turned his horse. He rode his men back up over the ridge the way they had come. The dust hung in the trail for a long time after they were gone. Garrett let out his breath. He lowered his rifle. He turned slowly on the wagon seat and looked at Verity. "Cornflower blue eyes," he said. "Cornflower blue eyes and a will of iron. Ma'am, was any of that true?" "Most of it," said Verity. "Mr. Caldwell is a real examiner. I wrote him in February. He wrote back that there was an inquiry, but that nothing had yet been filed. I extrapolated." "Extrapolated," said Garrett. "Aggressively," said Verity. Silas Thorne, behind the wagon, began to laugh. It was a low, rusty sound at first, the sound of a hinge that had not been moved in a long time. Then it became a real laugh, the kind that doubles a man over in his saddle, and Garrett caught it, and Ezra caught it, and the three Thorne brothers sat their horses and their wagon seat in the middle of the trail above the Bitterroot Valley and laughed until the buckskin tossed his head in protest, and Verity sat between them and laughed with them, and her hands only now began to shake. Ezra reached over and covered her hand with his. He did not let go this time. "We are going home, Verity," he said. "I know," she said. They rode the last 3 miles down into the valley with the Chinook at their backs and the bank draft safe and the woodshop chimney rising thin and blue against the late afternoon sky, and the spring of 1880 came down off the high passes behind them, and the snow on the south slopes was already beginning to pull back from the rocks. Bartholomew Crane was arrested in Helena on the 15th of March. The federal indictment ran to 47 counts. He died in territorial custody in 1882 without ever going to trial. His son Jasper, the man Silas had beaten with the hay rake, sold what was left of the Crane holdings and moved to California and was never seen again in Montana. The mortgage on the Thorne homestead was paid in full on the 20th of March with the bank drafts from Cornelius Ashby and a new loan from the same bank against the spring contract. The deed came back clean a week later. Ezra hung the deed in a frame on the wall above the hearth between the long rifle and the Bible. Verity and Ezra were married on the 30th of May in the little Methodist church at Fort Benton by a circuit preacher named Ralston, who had baptized half the children in the upper Missouri country. Mrs. Cora Whitfield stood up with Verity. Garrett stood up with Ezra. Silas brought a small mouth harp from his vest pocket, the kind that fit in the palm of a man's hand, and he played a slow waltz he had learned from his father. And the wedding party danced once around the dirt yard in front of the church, and Cornelius Ashby, who had ridden 2 days from Helena to attend, gave the bride away. Verity wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself. She wore her mother's cameo brooch at the high collar. Ezra placed a thin gold band on her finger. He had bought it at the same trading post where he had picked her up off the stagecoach 7 months before. He looked down into her cornflower blue eyes, the eyes that had read his letter 27 times in a Pittsburgh boarding house, and he said the vow the preacher gave him, and then he said, "For the part of the vow that was his own, you came off a stagecoach into nothing, Verity Brennan. I do not know how you turned that into something, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the morning you walked in." She did not answer in front of the preacher. She kissed him. That afternoon, they rode back up to the homestead, the four of them, and the door of the cabin closed behind them, and outside the porch, the spring rain began to fall, and the next morning, the country was green for the first time in 7 months. The first daughter was born on the 5th of February, 1881. They named her Lenora Marie after the sister who had not lived to be 20. Ezra cried when he held her. He told Verity later, cried at his own sister's grave. He had not been able to. The dam had broken 3 years late in the warm kitchen of his own house, with a daughter the size of a loaf of bread in his arms and a wife in the bed beside him. A boy followed in 1883. They named him Jonas Garrett after Ezra's father and after the brother who had stood up with Ezra at the wedding in Fort Benton. Jonas was a quiet child. He grew up to look exactly like his Uncle Silas. Mary Cora came in 1885, named for Mrs. Whitfield, who would die 3 years later and would be buried beside her husband in a small plot on the next homestead up the valley. William Ezra was born in 1888, the youngest, the wild one, the one who could ride a horse before he could walk. He would go to the agricultural college in Bozeman in 1906 and come home with ideas about irrigation that turned the south pasture into the most productive hay ground in the upper Bitterroot. Garrett married Lily Ashworth, a teacher from Boise, in 1882. They built their own cabin on the north quarter of the Thorne allotment and raised 3 sons, all of them as tall as their father and as quick to laugh. Silas married a young schoolteacher named Abigail Lockwood in 1884. He had courted her by carrying small wooden objects to the schoolhouse every Friday for a year, leaving them on her desk without a note until at last she walked out to the homestead one Saturday afternoon in early summer and stood in the doorway of his wood shop and said, "Silas Thorne, I have 11 of your your boxes, and if you intend to give me a 12th, I would prefer that you bring it to my house yourself and stay for supper. They were married 3 months later. They had two children, a boy and a girl. The girl, who they named Lenora, was born in 1887. Silas held her in his arms the night she was born, and he did not weep. He was past weeping by then. He simply looked at his daughter, and then he looked at his wife, and he said, "We have a Lenora again," and that was all. And Abigail understood, and she put her hand in his. The Ashby and Beale contract ran for 19 years. By 1890, Silas had a workshop in Fort Benton with 3 apprentices, and his pieces were going east on the Northern Pacific to Chicago and New York. By 1900, the cattle herd had grown to 400 head, and the Thorne Place was the most prosperous holding in the Bitterroot Valley. The piano was played every evening. Verity taught all four of her children, and then her nieces and nephews, and then in time her grandchildren. The white linen cloth was laid over it only when she was traveling, and even then for never more than 2 weeks at a time. Lenora Marie Thorne's grave on the ridge was visited every spring on the anniversary of her death. The fence was repainted every June. Wild flowers were laid inside the fence by whichever Thorne could climb the ridge that year. Ezra Thorne lived to be 61. He died in his own bed on a clear morning in October of 1907 of a stroke, with Verity holding his hand. His last words were, "You came off a stagecoach into nothing. Thank you for stopping." Verity buried him on the ridge beside Lenora. She lived another 33 years. She died in 1940 at the age of 83 in the same upstairs room she had slept in her first night in the Bitterroot Valley. By that time, the room had a wider window and an electric lamp and a photograph on the wall of 4 generations of Thornes on the front porch of the homestead. And the great-granddaughter who sat with her at the end was the one who would later find the pressed aspen leaf in the family Bible and know exactly what it was. The last clear thing Verity said on the afternoon before she went was addressed to no one in the room, because she was speaking to a man who had been gone for 33 years. "I came home, Ezra. I have been home a long time." She is buried on the ridge next to him and next to the sister whose chair was once kept empty at the south end of a long oak table, and whose name a young woman from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, had spoken aloud in a kitchen in November of 1879, and had thereby begun, without knowing it, to bring back to a house that had been waiting for her. The fence is still painted white. The wild flowers are still laid every spring. The piano is still in the great room. And somewhere every winter, the wind still comes down off the high passes and finds the cracks in the old log walls and remembers the names of the people who lived there and moves on.